Hi everyone, welcome back to the Frugal Kitchen. Today we're making a very inexpensive, delicious dinner, Spanish rice, which I've never made before, despite technically being Spanish and having this it really was a side dish in Louisiana growing up on a semi-regular basis. So you're going to start. I'm using a rice cooker. You can make this on the stove in a saucepan, I think, a really big one. But start with a tablespoon of olive oil and a tablespoon of vegan margarine. If you want this recipe to be vegan, turn the stove on low or turn the rice cooker on for a couple minutes and let the butter slash margarine melt. Now, these tomatoes I had in the freezer for a bit. I diced them up. I think they are 3 tomatoes. A friend of mine gave them to me, and I wasn't going to be using them in quite a while. So I diced them up and froze them and then found this recipe online. This recipe is from 5 Heart Home, and it looks like we are supposed to take a cup of pureed tomatoes and add it to the rice cooker at some point. So I'm going to puree my tomatoes. I'm measuring out a cup here. I'll throw it in the food processor and kind of liquefy it. You could do this with a blender too if that's all you have. You could also take a can of tomatoes and drain the liquid into um, a cup. I assume there might be, maybe there's not enough liquid for that. Um, you can make tomato sauce instead of pureeing your own tomatoes. Anything, I mean, maybe you can maybe even do ketchup. I don't know. I don't want to turn this into a honey boo boo thing, but ketchup might work in a pinch. The recipe says to take 1 cup of rice for this. I believe because the original chef didn't use a rice cooker, that they meant a cup, like a real cup, not a rice cooker cup. A rice cooker cup is 3/4 cup. I I measured that when I was cooking this because I was curious. I knew it was smaller, but I didn't know why. Why can't it just be the same size? Someone answer that. So I'm using more rice than the recipe calls for. I did a cup and a half because it looked like this recipe, I mean, either a cup is larger than I think, or this recipe is supposed to be a side dish and they didn't want to make that much. So a cup and a half. I haven't finished eating this actually, but I think it will be about 5 meals, maybe 6 if I am careful. You might want to do 2 cups instead if you really want a decent meal for you or your family. And then you're supposed to wash the rice and pour it in and kind of like mix all the oil and margarine onto the rice and let that cook for 3 minutes. I don't think that did anything on my brown rice. I think it does perhaps toast the white rice, but I saw no difference. So you may not need to do that. If you're looking to cut costs and save time, I would quite honestly skip the whole oil butter stuff. Now I'm debating how much water to add because the recipe says to add a cup of chicken broth or vegetable broth, and I'm going to make my own chicken broth slash vegetable broth using vegan chicken bouillon powder that I made. If you're using the same amount of brown rice that I am, I did 3 3/4 cup of water. For brown rice, it should be 2.5 cups of water to every cup of rice, and for white rice, it should be 2 cups of water for every cup of rice. This is really only for a rice cooker. I don't know the quantity if you're making it on the stove. Perhaps it's more, perhaps it's less. So that is my chicken bouillon powder. I did 3 teaspoons, but I wasn't actually trying to measure an exact amount. That was probably less than I was supposed to do for that amount of water. Then the recipe says to do 1.5 teaspoons of chili powder, which I don't have, so I did 1 teaspoon of cayenne powder, and then 1 teaspoon of cumin. It also said to add 1/2 teaspoon of garlic salt, but I don't have garlic salt, so I'm just doing salt to taste and half a teaspoon of garlic powder. Add half a teaspoon of oregano. Stir that well for now. We'll be adding some more stuff soon before we actually cook it. I don't recall if I said in the beginning that I'm technically Spanish. I don't try to mention that too much to people because the Spanish ancestors are from the 18th century, and obviously nobody I know remembers them, so how Spanish does that make me? No one in my family speaks Spanish, at least nobody that any of my living relatives know. However, one of my grandmother's maiden name is Romero. That is pretty common in Louisiana, so, but we are, like, the ancestors did come from Spain somewhere. So some Cajun food, not Cajun food, sorry, some Creole food uses tomatoes in it. Cajun food mostly avoids it because I guess tomatoes were kind of expensive and we didn't have as much money as the Creoles. So I've never, that's why I've never cooked Spanish rice before because it wasn't like a big thing growing up, but I definitely had it a few times. So after you add the spices, throw in the pureed tomatoes and then the rest of the diced tomatoes, which should be about a quarter cup, and let it cook. You're going to set your rice cooker to whatever time or setting it says for the type of rice you used. If you're using the stovetop method, you are supposed to boil it for a little bit. I would just double check the recipe and then let it simmer for 20 minutes. Um, you can see the rice has kind of stuck to the bottom of the pan, and this is a good turnout. If you use like a saucepan on the stove, you're going to have a worse outcome. You're going to have a bad time, like that ski instructor said on South Park 100 years ago. So it's basically done. I mean, it is done. It's done. Here I am putting on the plate. And I really liked this recipe. It smelled amazing when it was cooking. And I thought to myself, oh my God, basically all I had to buy special was the tomatoes. And I didn't actually buy it because my friend gave it to me. And so this basically cost me no money. And I thought you could really simplify this if you take out most of the spices, take out the vegetable broth or chicken broth, just have the water, the tomatoes, the rice, and maybe even just tomato sauce or like from a can of tomatoes, the watery red stuff that you drain out, that you basically throw down the drain. I'm gonna stick that in the freezer next time. And this was an amazing meal. It was very cheap, very vegan, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Happy eating!